The summer before 6th grade, CPS started coming around a lot. I know kids are often blind to the failings of their parents, but even now, 15 years later, I can't figure out why they came. I lived with my mom and twin brothers out in the boonies. That rural neighborhood now commands top-tier prices. Back then, though, it was such an undesirably distant area that my police dispatcher mother managed to buy a massive house with over an acre of oak forest. Mom worked nights and constant overtime, so I spent most of my free time babysitting. Part of me hated it, and part of me wanted to do it till the day I died. My best memories all come from that house. Summer evenings chasing my little brothers through the trees as twilight deepened into night. Winters spent huddled in front of the TV watching The Secret of Nim while the fire I wasn't supposed to build crackled merrily. I'd give anything to go back now. The first CPS worker came early one evening in mid-July. My brothers and I were on lawn chairs guzzling Kool-Aid Burst as a spectacular lightning storm fractured the cloudy green sky. Our entire neighborhood was a slope. Our across-the-street neighbors lived at the top. We lived at the bottom. The road was almost level with our roof. It made me feel paranoid all the time. Watched. So when a nondescript car parked in our easement, my hackles immediately went up. I batted my brother's shoulders. "Into the house, guys." Philip obediently folded his chair as the first warm drops of rain pattered to the ground. Patrick, on the other hand, gave me a look that could melt iron. The sea-glass sky reflected weirdly off his skin, painting him with sickly shades of green and gray. He shook his Kool-Aid bottle at me belligerently.
"When I'm done."
Up on the easement, the car door slammed. "No, now," I snapped.
"Just listen to her,"
Philip said nervously. Patrick gave him an angry look that quickly faded to uncertainty. I watched my brothers anxiously, frustrated at being shut out yet again. I was the one who had to sacrifice everything for them, but I was still an outsider. Footsteps tapped down our long, steep driveway. I looked up and saw a woman. She wore a dark suit. Long hair glowed like spoiled gold under the stormy sky. When she saw us all standing there, she smiled and jogged forward. She looked nice and she was very pretty, but my heart fell just the same. She slowed to a halt in front of me, shoes squishing on the damp grass. I noted, to my surprise, that she was shorter than me.
"Hi there, I'm Mrs. Milcom. I'm from Child Protective Services."
My heart felt slow and low somehow, like it had just fallen ill. How come? Philip sidled up behind me and took my hand. Her eyes, what I can only describe as burning hazel, almost the same color as her hair, flicked to him.
"I'm responding to a report. Can we go inside?"
A graciously helpless smile spread over my face. Conditioned response, I guess. We're supposed to be nice to adults, after all. "Yeah, but my mom's not home." She gave me a conspiratorial smile. Her teeth glimmered in the strange twilight. Unwholesome green subsuming the agreeable ivory.
"Just between you and me, that's the point."
Ms. Milcom sat us down at the kitchen table and I poured her some iced tea. She accepted it graciously, then began to ask questions while Patrick rammed his feet into the table.
"Do you spend a lot of time with adults other than your mother?"
"Mrs. Herrera."
Philip piped up.
"Who's that?"
"My teacher. I graduated kindergarten."
He said proudly.
"I don't know who my teacher is this year."
She smiled.
"What about you, Patrick?"
He looked down at his shoes and mumbled.
"I'm sorry?"
"Mr. Ball."
My temper flared. "She's not talking about your imaginary friend, dude."
"He isn't imaginary."
Miss Milcom touched his hand gently.
"Tell me about Mr. Ball."
Patrick aimed a particularly vicious kick at the table strut.
"He likes cows, the kind with horns, and teaches me games."
My inward cringe was curling into knots at this point. Pat, for real.
"How long have you known Mr. Ball?"
"Like, forever."
She turned her sharp, strange eyes to Philip.
"Have you seen Mr. Ball, too?"
"A couple times."
He said unconcernedly. Embarrassment and rage roiled in my gut. Maybe they were talking about this nonsense at school and frightened a teacher or something. Then they'd called CPS on us and put my mom's job in jeopardy, all because my baby brothers were dipshits.
"But I don't like him, so I don't see him anymore."
Finally, Miss Milcom looked at me.
"And you?"
Was she trying to make the boys feel validated? That's what my mom always did. I hated it. And I wasn't about to stop now. "I'm too old for imaginary friends, ma'am." She smiled. She asked a few more questions. All were mundane, although a few.
Have you ever had an IQ test? Do you know anything about your ancestry?
Struck me as odd. All in all, she wasn't there long. When she finished, I walked her back to her car, not out of politeness, but to make sure she was really leaving. I'm going to be telling my mom about this, I said politely, if that's okay. She gave me a sad smile.
Honey, you aren't allowed to tell your mother.
Looking at her, being close to her, made my heart feel slow and sick again. But
this is a classified investigation. If you tell her, we'll have to take you away. We don't really think she's done anything wrong, but we have to make sure. And until then, it has to be a secret.
Panic fluttered in my chest. What if the boys say something?
They won't.
She patted my shoulder.
Goodbye. I'll see you soon.
Keeping that secret should have been difficult, but it wasn't. It's terrible, but part of me felt happy, almost vindicated. I was 11 years old. It wasn't right that I was my brother's primary caretaker. Maybe CPS would do something about it, yell at my mom, maybe make her get a babysitter sometimes. Miss Milcom came several times that summer, at least twice a week, and always in the evening after Mom left for work. That sick, slow feeling in my heart never quite went away, but I warmed up to her. She was so pretty, so nice, and somehow so motherly. She lavished most of her attention on the twins, but that was the dynamic I knew. Anything else would have felt wrong. I didn't breathe a word to my mother. Neither did Patrick or Philip. She came for the last time on Friday, at the end of August. School had been in session for a couple of weeks. The boys were cranky, and I was fed up with them. On the first day of school, I'd made several friends. They'd invite me out for ice cream that night, but of course I couldn't go. I said I didn't have a ride. When several offered to have their moms pick me up, I had to admit I was stuck babysitting, and would be forever. It was the one thing my mom had told me never to do. "I'll get in trouble," she said. But I was tired of it. It was wrong of her to do that, to take away my whole life just so she could have free childcare. And it wasn't just me who thought it was wrong. CPS thought it was wrong too. Even Miss Milcom's smiling face couldn't lift my spirits. She gave me a hug, then pulled back and gave me her trademark smile.
I have something exciting to show you.
What?
Get your brothers and come see. It's around the back.
I rolled my eyes and stomped inside. Philip and Patrick were playing sorry at the kitchen table, predictably bitching at each other.
You said it meanly, Patrick.
Philip snarled.
I just said it like in the commercial, Philip.
He spat back.
That's how you're supposed to say it.
Guys, I sighed. Come outside.
How about no?
Patrick trilled. How about Miss Milcom's here and she needs us all outside? Something passed across his face, dark and almost discolored, like we were back in the middle of that lightning storm.
I don't care.
Well, I do. If you piss her off, she'll take us away from Mom, so get up. I kicked his chair. Philip was already on his feet. Patrick followed suit, glaring daggers. We went outside. A million crickets sang, a musical pulsing rhythm that echoed through the trees. Miss Milcom danced again and beckoned eagerly.
Hurry!
She led us through the property, expertly sidestepping trees and fallen branches. Bracken and twigs crunched under our feet as darkness fell. It seemed early for full dark, but then again it was only 2 months past the solstice. Of course days were feeling shorter. We were just as close to autumn as winter. She led us all the way to the property line, near the barbed wire fence that separated our yard from the neighbor's horse pasture. Our rusty, broken little shed huddled there. Well, it wasn't our shed. It was an ancient relic from the 1960s, something the old owner had left behind.
We're not supposed to go in there,
Philip said nervously.
There are black widows in there. Mom said.
Patrick added. Miss Milcom laughed.
Is that what she said?
She came over and dropped to her haunches in front of him.
Well, she's wrong.
She's not. I saw them last summer.
Black widows aren't in there. But someone is.
Her smile threatened to split her face in half. Stretching too wide, it made my cheeks ache.
Who?
Patrick said guardedly. She clapped her hands.
Mr. Ball!
Patrick immediately took several steps backward.
Don't be a chicken.
She stood up and went to the shed. To my astonishment, I saw a light spilling under the half-rotten door and through dry rot in the siding, cool green and rich gold. And there was noise. I strained my ears. faint but unmistakable, a triumphant procession of horns, like I was hearing a parade from very far away. Miss Milcombe opened the door. Some of it crumbled under our hands. The remainder creaked open, swinging from a single rusty hinge. It was a room, far, far too big to be in a shed, at least 10 times bigger than our entire house. Grand marble floors and distant walls that towered out of sight. I craned my head and saw a hint of flower vines. Miss Milcombe waved the boys forward.
Come look.
We all crowded to the entrance, even Patrick, though he hid behind me. The horns were louder now, keeping time with the insectile song ringing through the night. It was beautiful inside the shed. Green, gold, white, and black, all smooth, glimmering surfaces and breathtakingly beautiful indoor garden.
What is it?
Philip whispered.
Somewhere wonderful.
Miss Milcombe said.
Do you want to come in and look?
Before my eyes, the shed suddenly went dark. Then it flickered back to life and light, like a bad projection. I rubbed my eyes nervously. Miss Milcombe noticed and frowned. All at once, I felt dizzy and tired. The horns and bugs were overwhelming and painful, and her eyes, that warm, orange-tinged hazel, were almost maddening.
What's wrong?
She asked quietly. I'm mad, I said defiantly. Philip and Patrick looked at me.
About what?
My chest heaved. I looked at them, my little brothers, the most important thing in my life, my responsibility, and my shackles, too. About them, I snapped. Patrick withered. And this whole thing, it's stupid. It's all stupid. The world swam. The horns swelled and the night bugs soon became a fevered, painful screech. The rocky leaf-strewn ground hit my head and the world went dark. I woke up in the morning, swarmed with ants. I hopped to my feet, screeching, and ran into the shed. Dark, cramped, thick with cottony webs and the glistening black bodies of spiders. Screeching again and wildly shaking out my hair, I ran up to the house. Empty. No Philip, no Patrick, no Mom. I searched the whole house 6 times, praying I was crazy before finally calling the police. Long story short, my mother and brothers disappeared. The official theory is Mom hightailed it with the boys to start a new life. She was on the hook for child abandonment, but they never found her. CPS, of course, had never once received a report or sent an officer to check up on us. I went into foster care. It was awful, but I think I did okay in the long run. I graduated college debt-free and worked in corrections. I'm not a guard, pardon my language, but fuck that shit. I'm a therapist. I do good things like trauma counseling, but because of AB 109, I also have to do shitty things like teach parenting classes to baby killers. I guess that's life. At least I'm paid well. Eventually, I made peace with my plight. I'd misremembered everything, constructed some kind of Machen-esque Hellraiser-fueled narrative that leached some of the sting from my abandonment. But I got a letter today, and now I'm not so sure. It was a plain, water-spotted envelope. No return address. I rolled my eyes when I saw it. I've been getting these things lately, usually from car dealerships. I tore it open. A Polaroid slid out and plopped to the floor. It was a picture of my brothers, Patrick and Philip, clear as day, down to the waves and mismatched eyes, the left one blue, the right one brown. They stood in the room with a white floor. A figure stood behind them, cloaked in dusty shadows. Female, if I had to guess, wearing a ridiculous bull mask. Grimly ignoring the hot tears in my eyes, I pulled the piece of paper out of the envelope. It rattled wildly in my trembling hands as I read 4 earth-shattering words. One is still alive. I uttered a high-pitched wail as my knees gave out. Of course I called the police. They took the letter and the photo. I've been at the station all night, but they pretty much shut me out. It's probably a hoax, the sergeant said, but we'll make sure. I don't know what to believe. I don't know what to think. I've been on Google all night and I came across this thing about phantom social workers. CPS officers would visit homes and do weird things. When parents called the department to complain, they were told no CPS official had ever been dispatched to their house. The general consensus is that the whole thing was a hoax. But I guess I know better. My mother disappeared in August of 2003, along with my 6-year-old brothers, Philip and Patrick. They left me behind. My dad died when the twins were infants, and there were no living relatives on either side, so I went into foster care. It's been almost 16 years. I haven't heard anything from or about them since. Until a few days ago, when I got a letter containing an old Polaroid of my brothers, along with a note that read, "One is still alive." I immediately called the police. After receiving a lackluster response, I hired a private investigator. While I toyed with the idea before, I never went through with it because I was always afraid of what I'd find. It's one thing to suspect your mom didn't love you. It'd be quite another to find your family living the high life, happy and content without you. But knowing they were safe was more important to me, so I bit the bullet and hired a PI. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I had trouble focusing at work. I work at a jail where I provide counseling and classes to inmates. I'll be direct. Some of my patients killed their children. Some of them fit the stereotypical definition of evil. Far more, however, are incredibly sick and had no help. Not that that excuses what they've done, but when you work with this population, you have to understand that they need help and you better be ready to give it. One of these patients is named Michael. Michael spends most of his time in a drugged haze, so he isn't always up for therapy. I'm not sure I've seen him in a completely coherent state. That changed a few days ago. I entered his cell, blinking against the painfully bright light. He stood by his bunk, straight-backed and wide awake. My hackles immediately went up. It's never a good sign when the routine changes.
You didn't tell me,
he said quietly. I fought the urge to beckon the guard. I was his therapist. If I betrayed any fear or discomfort, he might never trust me again. What didn't I tell you, Michael?
You didn't tell me,
he repeated.
That they used your brother like they used my daughter.
The cell suddenly seemed too white. Michael himself looked painfully technicolor against the blindingly pale backdrop of his cell.
Lucky,
he whispered.
He ate your brother, but at least you have one left. He ate my daughter, and now I have no one.
1,000 tiny chills crawled down my spine.
He likes cows, you know, the kind with horns,
he said. Where did you hear that? Terror and rage pulsed in time with my heartbeat. This stupid asshole, this crazy, stupid, child-killing asshole, fucking a cop probably, some sick detentions officer with a big mouth and a power kink. Who have you been talking to? He backed away nervously.
You know who.
Michael, tell me where you heard that.
We played a game last night.
Who's we?
I won, so he showed me all about you.
Who are you talking about?
Mr. Ball,
he answered. Suddenly, I was back at my mother's kitchen table on a long-ago summer night, sniping at Patrick about his imaginary friend while an amber-eyed social worker watched. I realized dimly that Michael was crying.
He ate my daughter, and he ate your brother. He would have eaten the other one, but his priest loves little boys, so he let the priest pick one. He has a new name. My daughter never got a new name, but your brother, his new name is...
15 years of rage and pain exploded, and I screamed, "Shut the fuck up!" The guard hurried over, boots scraping on the concrete floor. His hand hovered over his taser.
Miss Hammond, is everything okay?
Humiliation and guilt swept over me, extinguishing the rage like a candle flame. I mumbled an apology and left. My supervisor found me pretty quickly and gave me a choice: suspension or a long vacation. I took the vacation. Honestly, I can't believe I'm not fired. Then again, this is a department that went to bat for 5 deputies who beat an inmate to death in the jail basement. I guess I should count myself lucky. Once I got to my car, I called the detective in charge of my case. He didn't answer, so I left a brief message about my inmate possibly having relevant information. Then I went to see my friend, Julie. Julie used to work with me. Last year, she transferred to Property and Evidence. By necessity, she now has full access to the criminal report database. As a therapist, I don't. I've never cared, but now I do. I told Julie I needed access to her report for work. She knew I was lying, but didn't care. Now that she's working evidence, her favorite hobby is reading the case files of former patients. This is when I found out about Michael. Fair warning, it's very disturbing. Michael strangled, decapitated, and dismembered his infant daughter, then called 911 on himself. When deputies arrived, he was covered in fresh blood, but the baby's body was gone. Michael was inconsolable. He claimed he'd killed his baby to save it from demons, but they came and stole her away. When investigators asked who'd taken the baby's body, he'd said it was his father's friend, Mr. Ball. Whether his father had such a friend is a mystery that will never be solved, since Michael's father died in prison 23 years ago. The police looked for an accomplice, but eventually decided Michael had disposed of the body alone. One grisly theory positioned that he'd run the pieces down the garbage disposal and followed with drain cleaner. There wasn't any explanation for that theory, but it made it into the reports nonetheless. Michael pled guilty and begged for the death penalty for failing his baby, but ended up with the life sentence instead. 3 years after the trial, hikers found the infant's skeletal remains at a campground in LA County. According to the autopsy report, the bones were covered in knife marks. Some were consistent with the dismemberment, but others were noted to be strange and symbolic. The file included photo attachments, but were all corrupted. Julie told me they'll have hard copies at the coroner's so that we could do a field trip there. I barely heard her. By this point, I was on the verge of a breakdown. It looked like my brother's imaginary friend wasn't all that imaginary, but that meant a human monster had preyed on my brothers. It meant I hadn't noticed, which meant it was my fault. I excused myself and ran to my car, where I promptly burst into tears. I was about a minute into my crying jag when the shrill ring of my cell phone gave me a heart attack. It was the PI. I took a deep breath and answered. He cut right to the chase.
Miss Hammond, I'm sorry to bother you, but when do you get off work?
Dread coiled in my guts. I can come now. May I ask why?
I found some information that I want to cross-reference with you. It's nothing terrible. This kind of thing just doesn't really go down well over the phone.
I agreed to meet him at his office at 5 p.m. He worked out of a retail space in a dying mall. To be honest, I thought the place had shuttered years ago, but a small strip bustled with shops, real estate offices, dojos, and even an adoption agency. His office was at the end. The honey-colored wood floor, white walls, and cheap Greek-inspired flourishes reminded me of my high school days, specifically the kind of trendy clothes a foster kid couldn't even dream of. It's stupid, but it dredged up negative feelings. The PI was nice, though, younger than I expected, with a calm, assured demeanor. He dressed and walked like a plainclothes cop, which enhanced the illusion of competence. When I introduced myself, he told me to call him Dusty. He led me to a cluttered yet neatly organized back office. Filing cabinets lined the walls, printouts, a giant desktop, and a laptop competed for space on an L-shaped desk. I recorded the conversation with my phone. I figured it might help law enforcement, if nothing else.
I apologize in advance,
Dusty said.
I'm very blunt. If I say anything to upset you, just call me right out on it.
I nodded. He looked at me carefully, then sat down and unlocked the computer.
I'm going to be straight. This is a rabbit hole. Bear with me, all right?
All right.
First, DHS had a problem with so-called phantom social workers back in the 80s and 90s. They chalked it up to bad record-keeping, but it came up in at least one big trial. In 1988, a couple faced serious charges in regard to 3 foster children. During discovery, the DA found out they were supposed to have custody of 7. The foster children said the missing kids were taken by a social worker named Michael Alder.
That's awful, I said quietly, struggling to hide my mounting frustration. What did this have to do with anything?
It's a drop in the bucket. This county has a lot of trouble keeping track of foster kids. The sheriff classifies most of them as runaways, which might make sense if they were all teenagers, but around 75% were under 12, and half were less than 2.
He glanced at me.
Are you still following?
Yep.
Okay. In a couple of cases, the foster parents disappeared with their foster kids. That's what happened with your mother and brother, yeah? They all disappeared together, and the authorities decided it was a parental abduction.
Yes? He leaned forward.
Here's the thing. Parental abductions specifically refer to situations where a guardian violates another guardian's right to the child via kidnapping.
But my dad's dead. He died when the twins were babies.
Did you ever meet him?
Of course.
What was his name?
Elliot Hammond.
Okay, well, you don't have a father listed on your birth certificate. Your brothers do, but it isn't Elliot Hammond.
I felt like I was sinking. What the hell was going on? I'd seen my damn birth certificate. How did I not know this? Well, who else could it be?
The father of record is Michael Alder.
I struggled to keep my composure.
And there's more. Your mother took out a pretty hefty life insurance policy after she disappeared with the boys. I traced it to an insurance company agent in Burbank.
He rifled through a manila folder and extracted a printout.
And the sole beneficiary is Michael Alder.
Okay, I don't understand. Are you saying my brother's father is a guy some child-abusing foster parents made up?
I know it's confusing, but we're almost done. I know you were a minor at the time, but did anyone release your mother's death certificate to you once they identified her remains?
For a long second, I didn't comprehend what he'd said. Then it all rushed in, physical and breathtaking as a blow to the gut. I tried to speak, but couldn't even think of words, let alone voice them. He repeated.
Did they?
My face twisted. I smiled reflexively in an attempt to hide it, even as my eyes filled with tears. What do you mean?
I'm sorry?
What do you mean? She's not dead. He looked like a deer in headlights.
The sheriff identified her remains in 2004. Didn't anyone tell you?
I tried to speak, but couldn't breathe. He leaned forward, hand hovering a few inches over mine, then leaned back.
Oh my God.
Somehow I'd got myself under control, maybe due to embarrassment, maybe because she'd basically been dead to me for so long. Whatever the reason, I recovered in record time. I'm okay, I said. Sorry, go on. Looking nervous as all hell, he said,
That brings me to the next point. I've dealt with this before. Not necessarily on this scale, but I've seen it. It looks like the sheriff mishandled the investigation and covered it up.
My breath hitched dangerously. Okay, can you help me find my brothers?
I can find Michael Alder because he collected the insurance payout.
He hesitated.
But can I be blunt?
I nodded.
Missing persons more often than not are dead ends. The trial probably stops with Alder. Even if it doesn't, I think we're looking at the worst case scenario. Are you prepared for that?
Yes, I lied. An anxious silence followed.
If you need resources or help, I can...
It's fine, I interrupted. I'm fine. Is there anything else?
That's what I have right now.
He stood briskly.
I'll call you the minute I know more. Feel free to call or stop in any time.
I drove home in a numb daze, but the minute I stepped inside my house, a dam broke. Anger and horror washed over me like a tide. I went on a screaming rampage. Furniture, bookshelves, decorations, literally everything but the TV ended up on the floor. When I was done, I collapsed in the middle of the chaos and wept until I fell asleep. I woke up long past dark to the chirping of my phone. I reached for it, half expecting to see my supervisor's number. I could practically hear her voice. I'm really sorry, hun, you're fired. But no, it wasn't even a phone call. It was a string of text notifications. They kept piling up, dozens cascading in faster than the phone could display them. Most were utter gibberish, but in the tangle were a handful of coherent messages. They ate one, but I saved one. We don't always know who we are. They mark the bones. It's a game. They like to leave clues in the open. Law enforcement knows. They've always known. I'm sorry I have the wrong number. This is a joke for someone else. Sorry if I scared you. 3 of the messages were photos. My brothers, standing together in a dark room, with puffy eyes and tear-streaked faces. The second was the strangest, blurry video still, completed with a bar of static. It showed a big room filled with masked people, a golden carpet cut through the crowd. One of my brothers, identifiable only by his tawny hair, marched up the promenade. A woman walked with him. A procession of adults in animal masks followed. The final photo was a creep shot of a willowy young man. It was either sunrise or sunset. The orange light in the distance obscured his features. Nevertheless, his face was exceptionally fine-boned and androgynous. It could have been nobody. Just a rando snapped by a hoaxer. But the thing is, my brothers spent their one and only school year being tormented for looking like girls. How would a hoaxer know that? I could barely breathe. It felt like thin breaths were burrowing in my guts rather than my lungs. I called 911. The dispatcher scolded me for tying up an emergency line and transferred me to the voicemail of the detective in charge of my case. In a panic, I called Dusty. To my shock, he answered. I explained what happened. He told me to screenshot the messages and send them over, and I did it immediately. Now it's a waiting game. I wish I hadn't lost my temper with Michael. The psychological damage I undoubtedly did to him was unforgivable. But there is another reason, a selfish reason. If he's right, my brother has a new name, and he knows what it is. But that bridge is burned now. I have no one to talk to and nowhere to go. I don't know what to think. I just know it's going to be a long night. In 2003, my mother disappeared with my 6-year-old brothers, Philip and Patrick. They left me behind. No one ever found them. I guess things turned out okay. I'm a therapist at a county detention facility where I work with violent offenders. Naturally, I never got over my family, but eventually I got used to it. I haven't heard anything from or about them since they disappeared. Until a few days ago, when I got a letter that reads, "One is still alive." An old photo of my brothers was inside, so I naturally assumed the worst and called the police. The day after that, one of my patients claimed that one of my brothers was dead. His name is Michael. He isn't well, and he's been incarcerated for years for killing his baby. He has no way of knowing anything about my brothers, but somehow he knew about them and their imaginary friend, Mr. Ball. Law enforcement isn't helping, so I hired a PI. It took him a day to find out my mother's remains have been located and identified less than 2 years after she disappeared. With that, my world came crashing down. My family isn't out there somewhere. My mom's dead. My brothers are missing. No one ever told me, and no one's doing anything about it. I've been trying to change that. First, I unearthed my birth certificate. The PI Dusty told me I didn't have a father listed, but he was wrong. The certificate read Elliot Hammond, as it should have. With that, my blood pressure went down a little. If Dusty was wrong about this, maybe he was wrong about the other things. I texted him a photo of the certificate, asking him to explain. Then, the moment 8 a.m. rolled around, I called the detective in charge of my case. His name is Moser, and so far, all he's done is ignore me. After a couple more failed calls, I dialed the general office number. A receptionist picked up right away. "Detective Moser is in," she said chirpily. "I'll transfer you." After a minute or two, she returned to the line. "He's with someone else at the moment." I quickly tried to explain my situation. This was a mistake. I was exhausted and scared, and none of it made sense. "Ma'am," the receptionist said, "if this is an emergency, call 911. I did, and they told me to call Detective Moser. Sounding decidedly less cheerful, she said, I'll transfer you to his voicemail. How's that?" "Don't bother." I hung up, right in time to see a text notification from Julie. Sarge approved my field trip. I told him I need to cross-reference an indexing error. "You good to go?" Torn between uneasiness and admiration, Julie's way too eager to break the rules. But damn if she can't open any door. I typed back, "You're a miracle worker. What time?" She texted back, "The coroner will be ready for us in an hour." I drove over immediately and parked. I checked my phone. No service. Figures it'd be the only part of the city outside my coverage area. Luckily, she arrived quickly. I got out to meet her. She pranced over, waving a sheaf of printouts in my face. "Look what I found." She flattened the paper against the driver's side of the window and tapped the top of the page. "Mr. Michael has related cases." I felt a surge of irritation. "What does that mean?" "It means his baby's death is related to 4 other deaths. I printed them up for my reading pleasure and made copies for you as a professional courtesy." "So, what, did he kill other kids, or?" "Doubt it." For the first time, Julie looked sober. "It might be an indexing error, but interestingly enough, all their digital supplements are messed up too." "Is that usual?" "Yeah, at best deputies upload like half the photos correctly, the rest end up corrupted. That's why they keep hard copies here." Julie folded the papers and shoved them unceremoniously into my purse. I headed toward the coroner's public entrance, but she pulled me around the back and used her key card to waltz into the employee area. Within minutes, we were in a warehouse. Just for context, one of the coroner's major duties is handling the estate of decedents. So, the warehouse was enormous. A drab gray monstrosity the size of a department store, filled to the brim with everything from boats and monster trucks to ancient desks and battered cardboard boxes of unclaimed belongings dating back to the 1920s. The back corner was dedicated to files. To my mild horror, their filing system consisted only of reinforced cardboard boxes marked with approximate date ranges. Julie grabbed a ladder and found the appropriate box in record time. It occurred to me that if I had half her drive, I probably could have solved this entire thing before I graduated high school. "These boxes are literally arranged backward and stacked upside down. Deputy coroners," she complained, are supposed to be the smart ones. If this is what our best has to offer, no wonder the agency's in deep shit. She hauled the box out and dropped it onto the concrete floor. The booming echo made me wince. "Hey," she called down. "Real quick, what are the related case numbers?" I read them off. To my surprise, they were all old. 2003, 1988, 1973, and 1958. "What? Give me that paper." She scanned it quickly. "Damn, Michael's either a time traveler or this really is a top-shelf index clusterfuck. Either way, we're going to find out." She tucked it into her shirt pocket and kept hunting. I took a deep breath and turned my attention to the file box. It was bulging with paperwork and badly disorganized. It took several pass-throughs to locate the file for Michael's daughter. By the time I found it, Julie had already found 3 other files. Now, I'd scanned the digital report just the day before. The report referred to Michael by his last name and to the baby as infant and decedent, but never by her name. The coroner file, of course, had her name, Sarita Hammond. Infant child remains recovered in at a ranch in the Tehachapi Mountains with unusual markings on her bones. Behind the yellowing report were hard copies of the crime scene photos. Several were missing. The only testaments to their existence were scraps of paper clinging to the mangled staple. I hesitated, then I had a look. The close-up showed photos of the infant's skull and her femur. Each was clearly etched with symbols: crescents, 6-pointed stars, triangles, rudimentary eyes, horns, and multiple combinations thereof. Julie came up behind me and dropped the final box with a deafening boom. I whirled around and gasped. She laughed. "Is this that bad?" She snatched the file, flipped through, stopping when she saw the skull photo. "Did Michael carve that shit into her skull?" While Julie marveled over the sheer insanity of that file, I found the others. The 2003 box was stuffed, but the other 2 were only half full. I started with 1958. My stomach dropped right to the center of the earth. Male child of an indeterminate age, found on the ranch in the Tehachapi Mountains. No photos, but the file described unusual etchings in his skull, femurs, and shoulder blades. His name was Peter Hammond. 1973, Petra Hammond, female child of indeterminate age. Skeletal remains located in the upper elevations of the Tehachapi Mountains. Perpetrator had carved symbols into her ribs and skull post-mortem. 1988, Philippa Alder. Female child between 4 and 7 years. Skeletonized remains desecrated with post-mortem carvings discovered in the Tehachapi Mountains. 2003, Philip Alder. For a long moment, I thought I would faint. Julie slammed Molly's folder down and rifled through the others while I struggled to maintain equilibrium. "So, what is it, like a cult thing? And 2 of them have your last name." She reached for Philip's, but I snatched it away. She gave me a very guarded look. "What's going on?" That's all it took for the dam to break. I told her everything, right down to Philip's birth father being called Alder. Her eyes got wider every minute, and her hand slowly drifted to her mouth. When I finished, she said, "I don't know if I believe you, but okay." She crossed the floor. She was very bright against the drab gray warehouse, almost too alive somehow. "Okay, so look, we never toss homicide evidence. We keep it all in boxes in the basement. If there's anything left for the cases, then it's in the property room. I'll check it out." She helped me take pictures of each file, police reports, autopsy reports, pictures and all, before putting everything back. We'd barely put the last box back in place when the office manager came in. She glanced at the boxes. "Find what you need?" "Sure did," Julie said. The manager squinted, then sighed and tapped the 1973 box. "I hate to be like this, but please put them back in the right order. This one," she trotted several yards down to where we'd put the 1988 box, "goes here and vice versa." "Well," said Julie, "since everything's backward and upside down, that's probably where they're actually supposed to go." I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The moment I left the parking lot, my phone reception returned and I received several notifications, 4 missed calls, 2 voicemails, and 2 text messages. Feeling sick, I pulled over and checked it out. Dusty called and left a message, and a voicemail. Everything else was from my boss. More than anything, I wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't afford to. I was on vacation in lieu of suspension. I was on the absolute thinnest of ice. So I called her back. She picked up immediately and didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need you to come in. Michael's having a breakdown because he thinks you don't want to be his therapist anymore. He needs to see you today." Excitement briefly overwhelmed me. This was it. This is what I needed. I quickly agreed and sped over to the jail. I heard Michael before I even stepped into the pod. He lay in front of his cell, rocking and screeching. My supervisor stood nearby with a nurse and a detentions officer, anxiously watching Michael. This was such a massive breach of protocol, letting him writhe around on the filthy floor. Then again, it could be so much worse. At least they weren't harming him. I strode over, ignoring the miserable heat in my face. This was my fault. Whatever else was going on in my life didn't matter. Not to Michael. I'd punished him for my own problems. And this was the result. I approached, wondering how the hell I'd be able to ask him about my brother with my supervisor watching. Fortunately, Michael saved me the trouble. His screams abruptly cut off when he saw me. He sat up, palm slapping against the floor, and smiled through his tears.
I'm glad to see you. I felt bad.
I tried to apologize to him, but he interrupted.
Richard. Mr. Ball says his name is Richard. Richard. Alter. Alder.
His lip quivered.
Don't tell them I told you.
I won't, I said. I would never. Since my boss was listening, I made sure to loudly apologize and reiterate my commitment to his treatment. After a few minutes, the nurse said, "Okay, Michael, are you feeling better now?" Michael nodded. "Then let's let Miss Hammond go. She has other work." I stepped back, but Michael struck out and grabbed my arm. The nurse froze while the officer reached for his taser. Michael smiled, even his tears welled in his eyes.
All the world's a stage. He's not a player yet, but he will be. He wants to be.
That smile soured into a broken frown.
Don't tell them I told you.
Then he let go, shuffled back into his cell, and crawled into his bunk. I wrote up an incident report, then left. Once I reached my car, I called Dusty. He answered immediately. This was clearly not a day for phone tag.
Glad to hear from you,
he said.
Okay. I found Alder, only the name's wrong on the birth certificates. The guy who cashed the insurance policy isn't Michael Alder, it's Michael Alter.
Are you sure it's the same guy?
It has to be, or he couldn't have cashed the policy. I still got a long way to go, but here's what I got. Ready to fall down the rabbit hole again?
Sure.
He's retired. Expensive house, several vehicles, trophy wife. The wealth seems disproportionate. He was in the military for 7 years, both active duty and as a psychiatrist, which doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. The biggest one being he's a Belgian citizen. He couldn't have been active duty. He also cropped up out of nowhere. No birth certificate or medical records. No college, no work other than that weird stint in the military. He didn't own a house or have an apartment lease before 2004. Now, Michael Alder was a co-owner on a vehicle title. It was a van that crashed in Virginia in 1988. The driver, an as-yet unidentified male, died on impact.
I fought my rising temper. Okay.
Listen, there were kids in the van. Boys and girls, all under age 10. No one knows where they came from or who they were. They all went into foster care. But guess what? Every last one of those kids ran away from their foster homes, and that's it. No other information. None of them ever resurfaced. None of them are working, or doing anything. They're all just gone.
Okay, so what does this mean?
I don't know yet, but...
My temper flared. Then why are you calling me? A long pause filled with the feverish click of a keyboard.
Please, just listen. I know you're upset. I'm sorry. This is why I like doing this in the office. But here's the last thing. Michael Alter only has one kid. A 21-year-old son named Richard.
Everything around me simultaneously became too bright and too still. I tried to swallow, but my throat caught. I kept thinking of the files. Peter, Petra, Philippa, Philip.
Miss Hammond, are you there?
I tried to swallow again and ended up gagging. The spell broke somehow. Can I come in? Now? I have some things. Some information.
I can't today. I'm booked for a couple days. How's Thursday morning?
My phone gave off the distinctive chime that signals incoming text messages. Yeah, I said thickly. I'll be there. Thanks. I hung up and stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over the text icon for what felt like a long time. Finally, I opened the thread. I don't think I can save him. I helped make him what he is. She won't let me tell you more. Please come for him. We love him. Balder, 9382. Wrong number again, sorry. And that's it. That's all I heard for a couple days. I've been trying to find Richard Altair online, but no luck so far. Dusty's checked in from time to time, promising that our appointment will be worth the time. Detective Moser finally called back this morning and agreed to see me tomorrow afternoon. That's good. It'll be after I talk to Dusty. I should have a lot more information. But I guess we'll see. In the meantime, I've been waiting for something, anything from that unknown number. Texts, calls, I don't care. Just something. But it hasn't come yet, and I don't know if that's good or not. A social worker named Miss Milcom visited my brothers and I several times over the course of summer of 2003. I was 11, going on 12, and almost solely responsible for my brother's care at that point. At the beginning of that school year, my mother disappeared with my younger twin brothers and left me behind, presumably to escape CPS scrutiny for reasons I would never know. This is what I believed until a couple of weeks ago, when I received a cryptic letter with an old photo of my brothers. Even worse, one of my patients, a man named Michael, who was convicted of killing his baby, started telling me things about my brothers that he had no way of knowing. The sheriff's department immediately started to stonewall me, so I hired a private investigator named Dustin Contreras. According to him, my mother's corpse was discovered before I even entered high school. My brothers were nowhere to be found. No one was looking for them. No one cared. So I started investigating the disappearances on my own. I found a lot of horrific information that indicates one of my brothers was killed a long time ago. My coworker, Julie, basically smuggled me into the coroner's archives to take pictures of the reports and evidence. Afterward, I immediately went home and pored over the autopsy reports. The children's skeletal remains were a nightmare. Their mouths had been packed with loose teeth and ashes, then bound shut with red fabric. The bones of the lower extremities showed scorch marks. Tool marks indicated that the top halves had been butchered and basically peeled off. And of course, each skeleton bore strange carvings on all of the bones. I thought of Philip and cried until Julie called me late that evening. "We don't have anything on those kids here," she told me. "The department accidentally purged all the evidence in 2002. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. How does that even happen? My head was pounding, but there was something, right? She told me what I already knew. Oral cavities packed with ashes and teeth, bound with red fabric, and made a half-assed apology on behalf of the department. Like I said, not much. I passed all the information on to Dusty, as well as the detective in charge of my case. Neither responded. Luckily, I had an appointment scheduled with Dusty just a couple days later. I arrived early. When he saw me, his entire body somehow sank into itself. He wouldn't meet my eyes either. Up until then, in person and over the phone, he'd been incredibly driven, super excitable, the kind of guy who dives headfirst into every weird piece of information he can find. But no more. He trudged into the back office and closed the door.
Have a seat, Miss Hammond.
He scratched his head, then slid into the chair across from me.
First, your bodies. Those kids. I'll be straight. This is going to sound crazy to you, but it's a coincidence. First, the victims' names aren't verified. Peter, Petra, Philip, none of those appear anywhere but those old reports. Legally, they're John and Jane Doe's. Next, the sheriff found all those bodies at a ranch that was, until recently, owned by a man named Basha Alder. He used to be a cop back in the day, so there's another coincidence. Anyway, he died in April and passed the ranch on to an heir named Tatiana Romanov.
Excuse my language, but how the fuck is this all a coincidence? Dusty closed his eyes briefly.
Listen, he didn't have anything to do with the deaths. According to the police reports, he cooperated fully with each investigation and was generally out of town whenever the bodies were discovered. They attributed the deaths to a probable cult that's been blamed for everything from child abductions to dead cats. Point is, there's nothing much to do there.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I also knew he wasn't budging on this. At least not right now. What about Michael Altair? He rubbed his face fretfully.
Look, nothing's adding up, and I don't know how much farther I can go.
He drummed his fingers against the desk, then leaned down and pulled out a folder. His hands hovered over the paperwork for a long moment, then he extracted a few pages and slid them in front of me. They were photos, candid shots of a ridiculously handsome middle-aged man and his ridiculously beautiful wife, maybe mid-50s and early 30s, respectively. They were in a dimly lit, expensive-looking restaurant. He looked radiant, and she looked sick. A hint of Dusty's enthusiasm returned.
This man lives in Michael Alter's house, spends a lot of time with Michael Alter's wife, and visits Michael Alter's son.
My stomach clenched, but I waited.
Of course, he goes by Michael Alter.
Then, what's the problem? Dusty hesitated again, practically projecting his internal struggle. Then he slid an old driver's license across the table. Richard Alder. The man in the photo was clearly a younger version of the guy in the candid shot. At a guess, maybe 30 or 35. The license had an issue date of 1982. A little weird, but maybe Alder just aged really well. Then I saw his birth date. January 8th, 1910. Where did you get this?
His wife, she's not well. Not really.
He leaned back and drummed his fingers again.
Look, Richard Alder is pretty clearly an assumed identity of some kind. I know your Alder's a creep, and I don't know what's going on between you and him. You have my sympathy regardless, but I'm not comfortable acting as a middleman for a vendetta, however justified it is.
What are you talking about? He nearly rolled his eyes.
Let's not do this.
No, tell me what you mean.
I know that this Alder is shady. I don't believe for a second that he's a good guy, but what your mother did isn't his fault.
What the hell are you talking about? Anger flashed across his face and he gave me a grim smile.
Okay, let's play a game, Miss Hammond. Your mother had an affair with Alder. Your brothers are his kids, but your birth father chose to raise them as his own. Fine. Happens. Good on him. But your dad dies, and your mom wants back with Alder. He turns her down. He doesn't want her, doesn't want your brothers. So she takes those boys and does God knows what before killing herself up at the campground.
He sent a stapled police report across the desk.
Straight from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office. The report also says you were notified, so I don't know, ma'am. I'm sorry. Alder's a bastard, but your mom's decision was her own, and I can no longer help you.
With that, he gave me a stack of slim file folders and sent me on my way. I didn't know what to say. I wouldn't have known how to say it even if I did. Somehow, that visit was less disappointing than the meeting with Detective Moser an hour later.
Miss Hammond,
he said brusquely. His office was too hot. Beads of sweat glimmered on his brow.
I just don't know. This looks like an attention grab to me.
I'm sorry, what?
There's nothing here that you couldn't do yourself. The letter, the old picture, this all looks like a hoax.
But I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. They're lost. My mom.
Recovered in L.A. I know it. That's not our jurisdiction. It never was.
There's a missing persons case, a missing child case. I know interdepartmental communication isn't the best, sir. I work here, but now that you have the information...
I think you found some information you didn't like about a rich man and decided to try to disrupt his life while refusing to grasp the context of the situation.
What context? He gave me a smug look.
Women in love aren't rational.
We argued. I ended up screaming at Moser and got escorted off the premises for my trouble. In a last-ditch effort of some kind of investigative help, I went to the regional newspaper office. I tried to explain what I'd seen and what information I had, but I sounded crazy. How could I not? The receptionist told me to make an appointment. In tears by that point, I went home and threw a massive screaming tantrum. When I finally calmed down, I went through all the information Dusty compiled. It's a gold mine, a horrifying, hideous, confusing gold mine. Police reports, autopsy reports, birth records, Michael Alter's address, and the name of a bar where Richard Alter works. And children, so many more little Jane and John Does scattered across the state like a geocaching game from hell. I kept thinking of Philip and Patrick, lounging in cheap Kmart lawn chairs, watching lightning storms flash over a roiling twilight sky. Of course, our isolated little lives as a modern-day boxcar children, taking care of each other in the woods. And I thought of Miss Milcom, with her lush, wild hair and sunset-colored eyes, of the insanities she'd conjured in the shed. How much of that was real? Had I seen my mother harm my brothers and blocked it out? Replaced her with a sinister other? The proverbial bushy-haired stranger? I cried for hours, then kept poring over the files, and I found something new. My patient, Michael, arguably started this wild goose chase. Michael's infant daughter, Sarita, went missing under peculiar circumstances. Michael hysterically confessed that he'd kill the baby to save it. He was tried and convicted, even though his apartment yielded no evidence of the act. The baby's skeletal remains were discovered, marked and scorched, the same ranch as Peter and Petra and Philip and Philippa's. The ranch was owned by good old Basha Alder. Until that point, the only documentation I could find referred to the baby as Sarita. Michael even refers to her as Sarita, but her legal name was Sarai Hammond. Thing is, that's my name, too. Chills rolled up and down my body. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, and I uttered a dry, involuntary sob. What was I supposed to do? The police don't care. Dusty's a lost cause. I love Julie, but she's just a cop groupie at heart. And even if all of them were willing to listen, what could I say? What wouldn't sound insane? I needed proof. Apparently all the dead bodies didn't count. But maybe a live one would. A growing sense of calm slowly suffocated my panic. That was it. I needed to find my brother. Fortunately, I had his home address and his place of work, thanks to Dusty. Somehow, I slept. In the morning, I loaded up and made the 2-hour drive to LA. Patrick, I kept reminding myself, my brother Patrick, lived in a gated apartment complex in Hollywood. Like the vast majority of the city, it was distinctly unglamorous and almost unsettlingly grimy. I parked and took several minutes to prepare myself. I scanned the photos, the texts, the birth certificate, and the police report several times, ensuring I had everything. Then I got out and wove through the complex until I found his door. I stared at it for what felt like a very long time. The sun beat down on my neck, coming and receding in waves. Finally, I knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open. And there he was. Silky yellow hair, mismatched eyes, and a preternatural complexion like gold-tinged porcelain. A beautiful little boy grown into an almost inhumanly beautiful adult. He smiled affably.
Hi, can I help you?
I tried to answer, but only choked as tears flooded my eyes. Concern quickly overtook his smile.
Miss, I'm sorry, are you alright?
He covertly scanned the area.
Are you running from someone? Do you need help?
I took a deep, shuddering breath and desperately tried to swallow the lump in my throat. My name is Sarai Hammond. I think you're my brother. Pity touched his face and he smiled again.
I don't have a sister.
The air was still and heavy, almost suffocating. Sunlight glanced off trees and rails and their carefully manicured grass, creating 1,000 shards of misplaced gold. Patrick, the name issued in a breathy, wet gasp. Where's Philip? Something crossed his face, an emotional fissure opening under that sweet, assured smile. Where did Miss Milcom take you? Who's Mr. Ball? I held out the Polaroid, old and creased, showing the boys and a woman in a bull mask looming behind them. His hands started to shake. He kept glancing between me and the photo, his confused smile battling with a rictus of horror. It was awful to see, like two faces, two people vying for dominance within a single body. He smiled again right as he started to cry.
Sometimes I think you're a dream.
I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the cryptic messages from the unknown number. Did you send me these? He squinted, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was sobbing.
No, that's Rachel. Oh my god, that was Rachel.
Who's Rachel?
Nobody.
He carefully took the photo from my hands and studied it, wide-eyed and somehow tender. He gently touched the woman in the mask.
Right now, she's Gabrielle.
He looked up suddenly. His face was different, not frightened, sad or confused. Angry, fevered, almost old somehow.
You need to leave.
Patrick!
Go away!
His face broke apart again, fissure opening and closing, terror and cold rage checkering his features.
I don't know you.
It doesn't matter. It's okay. You're my brother. I'm going to help you. Something awful happened to you and I need to know what it is. A dim, resigned cruelty rose from the fissure that settled onto his face.
You don't know anything. You never did. You never will.
He backed away and started to close the door. In a panic, I grabbed his arm. He immediately threw me off. Patrick! I yelled. Please come back!
To what? For what?
He stalked forward. I stumbled back and nearly fell.
You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what I am. You don't know who I am. Your brother's dead.
A terrible weight had been building in my chest, the kind that traps your breath and crushes your words. But you're here. His face twisted, then hardened.
Don't come back.
My brother, my only family, my only hope, stalked back into his apartment and slammed the door. After a long crying jag, I went ahead and tried to go to Michael Alter's house out of sheer desperation. No dice. It's tucked into a canyon behind an honest-to-God wall. Numb despair set in. This was it. Patrick recognized me, but he didn't care. The police didn't care. Dusty thought I hated Alder because my mother killed my brothers. I don't know what I would have done if my phone hadn't started buzzing in my pocket. I pulled it out, fumbling and nearly dropping it. Some of the despair eased, giving way to fear and excitement. Alder 9382. Stay away from the house. Go home now. I'll come to you, I promise. I held my breath, waiting for the ridiculous sorry wrong number sign-off. Instead, I got this. Mr. Ball will see you soon. I went home. There was nothing else to do. It's been several days. I thought I'd have some kind of resolution by now. I did try to contact law enforcement and tell them Richard Alter is my missing brother. I keep following up, to no avail. No one's come to see me. Not Patrick, not the texter, certainly not Mr. Ball. One way or another, I hope that changes soon. I went back to work as soon as I could. I had to. My paid leave had run its course, and I needed money to live. Besides, going back meant I'd have access to reports, databases, and resources I could use to help my brother. Given that Dusty had dropped my case and Julie was ignoring me, I needed that access desperately. I wasn't supposed to handle Michael's therapy, but county jails are county jails, with overworked, undertrained, and overpressured county staff. There are days when everyone, exhausted, angry, or verging on burnout, calls out except you. That happened the day I went back to work, which meant I had to take care of Michael. The moment I opened Michael's cell, he ran out and snatched a pin from my pocket. The deputy, an entire flight of stairs below, didn't even notice. Michael regarded me with a mixture of ecstasy and horror that made me panic.
Mr. Ball is coming,
he whispered urgently.
He knows I told you. He's gonna make me do something now. It's not your fault. Officer, this is not her fault, okay?
Michael stabbed himself with the pin before I could react, screeching as he dug it through his arm like an oar from hell. Blood welled quickly, impossibly, gushing over him like a reverse whirlpool. Then he spun around and smeared his blood all over the wall, forming 3 sloppy, dripping words. Love from Aman. The guard finally appeared in the doorway, stern and cold. Michael immediately fell to his knees and smashed his head into the toilet. Jail toilets are solid bricks of iron. And he made quick work of himself. Teeth and blood flew across the room. His head dented, then caved. It was ethereal and dreamy, oddly slow. I saw the dent form, saw it become deep and wide as blood sheeted over it, then deeper and wider, and then he crumbled to the floor. The guard's cold facade had long since shattered. He sobbed into his radio, begging for assistance. My knees felt like they'd evaporated. I lowered myself to the ground, dimly aware of the wet warmth as Michael's blood soaked through my pants. Michael's face was a convex ruin. Shards of teeth erupted from his mouth, stabbing the remains of lips that had split all the way up to his nose. I knelt in his blood, eyes trained on the message above. Love from Aman. Hope finally arrived. Michael was still breathing when they evacuated him, but he died on the way to the hospital. I was formally suspended within the hour, with pay, but that wouldn't last long. Therapists who watch their patients commit suicide don't last long. Never mind that he'd written the auditory equivalent of my name on the wall. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in a nightmare. Every time I turned, I expected to see Miss Milcom, ember-eyed and smiling, or the mysterious Mr. Ball, who in my mind was a hulking, unspeakable darkness. Paranoia swallowed me swiftly. I eventually locked myself in my apartment, partly to wait, partly to pore over everything Dusty had given me again. He'd gathered a great deal of information on my mother that I'd skipped over before. I was too concerned with my brothers and Michael Alder to bother with my mother. The first irregularity was her birth certificate, or rather, birth certificates. On the first, she had no parents on record. Her birth certificate had several blank fields. On the second, her parents were listed as Basha Alder and Christine Amon. Dusty also obtained her autopsy reports from LA County. Again, there were two versions. One stated that her body, which was too decomposed to ascertain her cause of death, was located in a campground. The other stated that her bones featured strange, rune-like marks and that she'd been discovered on a property owned by Michael Altair. By midnight, I was trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of laughing and crying. The colors in my rooms were too bright and rich, like someone had trapped me in a cartoon. The shadows held too many colors, and the light was too flat. My head was buzzing, my stomach hurt, and my throat felt cold and slimy, like I was coming down with a fever. But of course I was. I'd played slip and slide in Michael's blood on a jail floor, breeding ground of filth and bacterial crust and MRSA, and my throat clicked. I kicked back, sure I was going to vomit and unwilling to ruin my documents. Then the urge subsided as abruptly as it had come. I pulled the photo of my brothers and set it beside our mother's autopsy report. I tried to focus, tried to let the pain simply be pain without the horrific overtones of paranoia and terror, but things moved into my periphery. Those colorful shadows encroached, sliding silently over the room like the ghost of an oil slick. Within that oil slick, glimmering like gemstones, were a pair of eyes. My stomach flipped, and I fought the urge to look. You're imagining it, I told myself. Seeing things, just seeing things that aren't there. Then another pair flared to life, glittering serene black, so much darker yet so much brighter than the shadows around it. Then more, and more, and more. Green and blue, yellow and amber, chocolate and hazel, gray and violet, the gazes of 100 impassive gods. Then suddenly, they blinked out, in ones and pairs and trios, extinguishing like candle flames. The floor creaked and the shadows spun together, reminding me absurdly of a cotton candy machine, as they spiraled together and became a small and terribly solid figure. Eyes blazed like embers for the briefest moment, then changed, became mismatched. One brown and one blue. The phantom darkness receded with a sly swiftness that made me wonder if it had ever really existed, leaving a desperately familiar little boy in its wake.
Why?
Philip quavered.
Did you let her take us?
Everything inside me seemed to evaporate, leaving me a gutless, spineless, matterless rag doll.
You were supposed to watch us.
A shrill, breathy sob ensued. Recalling a memory with such vivid force, I burst into tears. The day Philip accidentally shot Patrick in the face with a BB gun. They'd run in, Patrick shrieking, Philip uttering those horrifying, squealing gasps that made me think he was dying. I could practically see them standing in my living room. Patrick clutching his face as blood trickled down his cheek, and Philip, puffy-eyed and struggling to speak.
You knew.
Patrick breathed.
You were happy we were gone. They told us so. You thought we deserved it. You let them take us because you didn't love us.
No, I whispered.
They made us fight each other to see who was stronger. The loser had to go to Mr. Ball's friend.
His face crumpled and tears streamed down his face.
Patrick won.
The room began to swim. I realized I wasn't breathing. Wet blotches of scarlet blossomed across Philip's narrow chest.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't help them hurt him.
His face crumpled, then suddenly hardened into a wild rictus of hate.
So he won, and he hurt me. He didn't even need help. He just did it.
His chest warped upward and split open, making me scream. The incision widened roughly open, as if an invisible monster were hacking him apart. Bloody, flesh-colored snakes rose from his arms. It was such a surreal sight that I didn't quite realize what I was seeing. Not snakes, but skin. Flayed skin, stripping itself from his bones. I tried to cry, but barely managed a raspy, wet whistle. Philip screamed and writhed, flailing against restraints I couldn't see. His skin continued to slow away, arms and legs, chest and back. Finally his face. Blood streamed from every surface and every orifice, flooding to my floor. The puddle crept toward me, silent assurance contrasting sharply with my brother's tortured throes.
It's your fault. That's what they told me. You wanted us dead. You let them have us so you could have a better life. I died thinking you hated me. I died hating you.
A final miserable scream exploded from him. Then his head caved abruptly, just like Michael's. His eyes and the bridge of his nose disappeared into a skull. All that remained was a small, bulbous forehead and a hideously upturned tip of his nose. They met in the middle of his face, looking more like a deformity than an injury. Each one of my muscles fought to collapse. I realized I was tearing my own hair. Coarse strands of yellow hair tangled between my fingers. My face hurt, beyond raw, beyond stinging. It felt flayed, burnt. I was afraid to touch it. Then Philip jerked, and in a single fluid motion, sat, rose to his haunches, and slid towards me. That face, so absurdly like a fallen cake, hovered mere feet from my own. Half a bulging, bloody eye peeked below the crumpled overhang of his forehead, no longer blue or brown, but a queer amber orange.
What would you do for your brother?
I thought my heart would burst, horror and hope intertwined, growing and threatening to rupture my heart. Anything. The misshapen slope of his mouth broke into a smile. He took my hand. His fingers were small and tacky, feverishly hot.
Promise?
I promise. His hand went to my face. I thought it was a caress, but his fingers suddenly tightened, burning nails digging into my skin, and tore a piece of flesh away. I watched, frozen, as he placed it on his tongue and swallowed. Then he stood and hobbled to my bedroom door. I watched, dazed and only dimly aware of the awful pain in my cheek. As he opened it, past the frame, I saw, not bed or dresser or rug or window, but a dark, glittering room, dancing firelight reflected off the polished floor. I tried to stand, but my muscles wouldn't obey. Philip threw a glance over his narrow, flayed shoulder. His face was horror beyond comprehension. The sight made me weep. He smiled again, broken teeth glinting under that ruptured, ember-colored eye. Then he crossed the threshold and closed the door. The moment he disappeared, panic reared up and propelled me to my room. I threw open the door, but saw only my room. Ordinary and untidy, no firelight, no marble floors, no Philip. I spun around helplessly. Blood covered the floorboards in the middle of those horrific, snaky strips of my brother's skin, and spelled the words, "Love of Amon." Somehow I slept. I woke around dawn, cleaned up the mess, bandaged my face, and tried to call Dusty. I don't really know why, I guess to beg him for help one more time. He didn't answer, so I went to his office. The lights were all blazing, but the opening was covered by a pull-down grate. Out of desperation, I tried the grate. I know they're normally locked, but this is an old, neglected, decaying mall, so after a quick glance in both directions, I gave an experimental push. And it went up. Unable to believe my luck, I darted inside. The smell hit me almost immediately. Cloudy and humid, sweet and corrupt. I knew what it was in an instant. I found Dusty's body slouched at his desk. He was naked, his skin a marbled horror of plucked chicken yellow and bruisey black. His eyes, dull and cloudy, yet glittering, had sunk halfway into his skull. Dry lips had begun to recede from his teeth. Both his hands were gone. His desk was empty. The computers, files, and supplies had been smashed against the wall. In their place were dull, discolored things like sticks spelling out 3 words. Love to Amon. I called the police and was promptly arrested. It felt like forever. I wept for my brothers, my mother, Dusty, and myself. They pulled me from the holding cell just a few hours later, shoved a property retrieval ticket into my hand, and pushed me out into the dusk. My keys and wallet were in the evidence facility, which closed at 5. It was already 7. Without cash, keys, phone, or ID, I'd resigned myself to walking 2 hours to Julie's when a sleek white car pulled up to the curb. I eyed it suspiciously as the driver's window went down. It was a deputy, thick-set and friendly, a bit like a clean-cut Samwise Gamgee.
Courtesy shuttle for employees. I'll take you where you need to go.
I was so tired and scared, it didn't occur to me that the incarceration of sheriff's personnel couldn't possibly be common enough to warrant a shuttle, so I climbed into the back seat. I realized I wasn't the only passenger just as the doors all locked. I recognized him immediately from the photos, lean and dark-haired with jewel-bright eyes and a face far too young for 50, let alone 108. A pleasant, smoky scent drifted off him, like a bushfire mixed with caramel.
You look just like your brother.
He had the perfect voice, smooth, gentle baritone with a faint European clip. "Your son," I whispered.
In a way.
The car pulled away from the curb.
Settle in and calm down. You won't be hurt tonight. I'm only taking you to see your brother.
Dusk had deepened, leavened only by the remnants of a dying sunset, which weren't so much light as colored shadows. I felt sick and ill, like I was in a fever dream. "My mother died at your house."
Your mother meant to abscond with her charges and was punished. I did not punish her.
"Then why did they find her at your house?"
Leverage.
The car pulled into traffic. 10,000 questions clawed into my throat, creating a paralyzing psychic bottleneck.
Listen to me. You have stumbled upon an empire no one sees, controlled by powers you will never understand.
The bottleneck suddenly broke, and I sputtered. "Was Miss Milcom one of you?" His facade, calm, impersonally cheerful, broke. All at once, he looked tired and sick.
Milcom is much more than that.
"What about Michael's baby?" The question surprised me. Sarita.
Your half-sister, a little princess just like you, with the same name and an entirely different purpose.
The others, Philippa, Petra, Peter?
Gifts to bind two entities.
I didn't understand this, and didn't want to. What happened to my brothers? Tears swam in my eyes, stinging hot.
Everything that was intended. That is why I'm here. You do not understand what Richard...
His name is Patrick.
Yes, he is Patrick. And depending on the occasion, the need, and the handler, he is also Richard, Jonathan, David, and Raphael.
Another delicate pause. I couldn't tell if he felt sorry for me, or if he was simply mocking me.
I don't know what you believed. I don't know what you told yourself, what justifications or nightmares ran through your head. Whatever they were, I promise you, the reality is much worse.
Why did you take them instead of me?
Old gods are hungry.
The impression of being in a fever dream redoubled, making me nauseous.
If we let them have their way, that is to say, if we feed them everything they asked for, there would be no balance.
Terrible images filled my head. Michael smashing his own head in. Babies butchered and burned until all that remained were bones inscribed with names of forgotten demons. My mother murdered and hidden in a rich man's yard. And Philip, poor Philip, who died hating and feeling hatred while our brother killed him. So your child murder is the secret to universal harmony?
One way or another, gods need flesh and blood and bone. They do, and give anything to get them.
I thought of his house, a mission-inspired manor nestled in some of the most expensive land on Earth, of his beautiful wife, of my beautiful brother, of Alder's expensive suit and his sleek, silent car. Hysterical laughter thumped against my ribs, but didn't quite dare to escape.
A mutually beneficial arrangement. You sacrifice people, innocent people, children, babies.
I don't. A hint of urgency colored his tone.
But the world has always been this way. It will always be this way.
The smoky, sweet smell was no longer pleasant. The beginnings of a headache prodded at my temples, pressurized and sharp. What happened to Philip?
Your brothers were handpicked by Milcom. They were trained, as I was, as your father was. Then they were made to fight. The winner moved forward, the loser was punished by the winner, then given over to the trainer as a treat, as is custom.
Is he alive? The words shattered into a dozen pieces, broken and mismatched in tone and pitch.
Treats are for consumption, are they not?
At that moment, I would have given anything to die. We passed 2 small towns and entered a third, driving long after houses gave way to golden hills and rocky slopes. Finally, we reached a long, curving road marked with a street sign that read Balder Lane. Balder Lane snaked up a massive hill and deposited us atop a breathtaking plateau. Directly across from an equally breathtaking house, 4 elegant wrought iron numbers gleamed beside the door. 9382. Alder let me out. I thought about bolting, but to what end? The hill was steep and rocky, peppered with boulders and twisted valley oaks. I'd kill myself scaling the hill. If I tried the road, the car would catch me in an instant. Dusk swiftly deepened to blue darkness, swallowing the breathtaking view of city, valley, and sweeping hills below. An unseasonably brutal wind whistled past, sweeping my hair and my neck and knifing through my clothes.
Come inside.
He led me to the house. The moment our feet touched the porch, the front door flew open, revealing a rich, golden wedge of light. Alder led me through, past a frantic woman in a stunning dress.
Michael, Gabrielle is no longer in
She broke off when she noticed me. Creases streaked across her face, cutting lines into the thick layer of makeup powder.
Who is this?
Richard's sister. Mr. Ball invited her personally.
Her eyes flicked to the ugly divot in my cheek.
But Aman
Clearly gave its blessing, using Ball's own language. I will see you to Gabrielle.
He steered me through a golden entrance hall, past a parlor echoing with soft laughter and crystalline tinkling, beyond several closed doors and a spiral staircase, to a door at the very end of the hall. Alder rapped curtly. Inside, a woman started to scream, but not nearly loud enough to drown his words.
You know all the world's a stage.
She abruptly fell silent.
Please open the door. I've brought Richard's sister.
The door opened. Alder strode in, pulling me behind him. It was a small, swelteringly hot room, lined with mirrors. Elaborate masks hung from pegs set into the wall. Jars and bottles lined the gleaming counter. It reminded me of a dressing room. The tall, beautiful woman weeping in the closest chair reinforced that impression. Alder made me sit next to her, then took the seat on the other side.
She now belongs to Ball because of you, so tell her about her brother.
I tried to save him. Her eyes were unfocused, voice hysterical and wandering. He knows. I told him. I proved to him about bluebirds and blackbirds. I told him what he is, what they'll make him do. He said he didn't care. He wants his life to be worth something. He doesn't want everything he went through to be for nothing. Since he had to suffer so much for so long, he wants his reward. Her face twisted miserably, then hardened as she turned to Alder. Where is he?
In the pit.
Not him. Where's Thomas? What did you do with Thomas?
He's by the sea, right where you left him.
She released a frustrated scream.
Calm down. You'll be on stage soon.
She seized strangely, then clumsily buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved. No, she whispered. No, I won't. No, I won't. No, 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 no. Then she gave a great shudder and seemed to melt, flattening against the counter. I waited, heart pounding against my ribs. Finally, she looked up with a smile. I jumped. Her eyes were preternaturally bright, halfway between honey and flame. She touched my injured cheek. Blood of Aman, pledged to Ball. I didn't know what to say, though Philip, flayed, broken, crushed, and bleeding, filled my mind's eye. She smiled. This is a life-changing night for Richard. Let's try and look like it. She quickly picked an assortment of makeup jars from her counter and the drawers beneath. What followed was the most surreal makeover of my life. My mind and body tried to fight, but every time anger, rage, or panic reared up, those yellow eyes fixed on mine, and nothing seemed to matter. Alder watched silently until the end. When she turned me toward the mirror, a porcelain doll stared back at me. Wide blue eyes and snowy skin set off by corn silk hair. I didn't look real, but then I didn't feel real. She smiled, fired on my snow, and said, "You look just like him." I wanted to ask who she meant, but didn't have the courage. "Thank you. My name is Gabriel. Come, it is nearly time to see your brother." She led me out of the room. Alder followed. Together we moved through the stunningly opulent home. Gold and white everywhere, an entire mansion built from gilded light, until we reached a second staircase. At the bottom was a single door of dark wood, wreathed in an ornate frame. Gabriel guided me through. I froze. Black, glimmering walls towered into the darkness above, at least 3 times as tall as the house itself. Vines draped the walls and hung from the corners, drooping with luminescent blossoms. Velvet seats circled a deep pit rimmed in gold, and at the head of the pit, an altar stood between 2 ivory poles topped with burning torches. On the opposite wall hung a stunning banner of a golden bull's head. Gabriel led me to a seat nearest the altar. "Wait here," she told me. Then she and Alder disappeared through a small, recessed door to my left. It might have been a minute, it might have been a day, but eventually 3 doors opened together. One behind the altar, one to the right, and the one Gabriel had gone through. People flooded through, all wearing robes and ornate animal masks. They streamed past without so much as a glance in my direction. When every seat had finally filled, the chamber went dark. Only torchlight remained. The door opened again. I heard a whispery rush as every head turned, and there he was. Richard strode solemnly into the room, carrying a large, wriggling bundle under his arm. He walked along the edge of the pit and knelt before the altar. A moment later, something huge and golden danced in the darkness, slowly resolving into the shape of a bull's head. A headdress, overlarge and breathtakingly ornate, clinking with chains of gemstones. The wearer was a tall woman, naked except for a skirt that danced around her hips like a phantom. She stopped at the altar and removed her headdress. I was not surprised to see that it was Gabriel. She balanced the bull mask atop the left torch. Fire blazed and danced from its eyes and jaw. It almost looked alive. Richard set the bundle on the altar. Rachel unwrapped it carefully, revealing a squirming infant. Fine yellow-white hair coated its scalp, gleaming in the firelight.
"Blood and bone and flesh of mine,"
Richard murmured.
"tendered to the lords of earth."
Gabriel extracted a gleaming blade from beneath the altar. The child did not even have a chance to scream. When she finished, she balanced a tiny blood-filled skullcap in her hands. The drained, decapitated body lay forgotten in a pool of congealing blood and brain matter. Gabriel rounded the altar. Richard looked up at her as she delicately tipped the skullcap. Blood dripped onto his hair, his face, and his open mouth. The person next to me grabbed my hand. I rolled around. Philip again. Broken and smashed. The warped remains of his mouth bent into a smile. Gabriel's voice suddenly rang out. "Amon's daughter, willing maidservant of Baal, approach your brother to whom you swore aid." But he was right there. Philip was here at my side. I turned and saw an empty seat. My cheek flared with pain as horror twisted around my heart. Had Philip, or the thing wearing Philip's skin, ever said Philip's name? I had no time or energy to ponder. I stood and obediently went to the altar. I slipped on the polished rim of the pit and nearly fell, but Richard caught me. "Kneel," he said. I did. Gabriel pressed the skullcap to my lips. 3 small, lukewarm drops of blood slid onto my tongue. "Given over and willingly bound, your master's honor and reward shall reflect upon you," Gabriel began. Her voice became thin and distant, like a faraway song carried on a wind. Overhead, the bull's blazing eyes danced and blazed. I leaned over and threw up. I woke, sore and bruised, with a salty metallic tang in my mouth. I shot up, gasping, and saw my own sun-drenched bedroom. Cleaner than it has ever been, but undeniably mine. The only thing out of place was a piece of trash on my dresser. Only it wasn't trash, but a note. This is what happened, and what it said. Gabriel broke Patrick into pieces, into other people. She couldn't break Philip. Your brother Patrick didn't kill Philip. Richard killed him. Richard consecrated himself. Patrick did not. Baal bound you to Richard. If Richard dies, you will be free. Don't trust me, even if I come to you. There are too many people inside me. I'll send someone to you. His name is Thomas. I am so sorry. Richard will come to you soon. Do what he says. It only lasts until he dies. I am so sorry. I promise I will fix this. I checked my house, shaking the entire time, empty and terribly clean. I went back to the bed and slept for days. Richard did come for me. He needs help with many things. Most, though not all, are mundane. I won't tell you what they are. There's no point. I don't have many answers, but this entire thing reaches far, farther than my country. It's a religion, an ancient, bloody, hideous religion that yields riches and power to the right people. I won't be able to stop it, but I have hope. Last night, a man came to my door, dark-eyed and olive-skinned, with beautiful russet hair and a weather-beaten face. Not old, but ill-used. He smelled like a cold wind and sand and seawater.
"My name is Thomas. Rachel sent me." I know you don't know me, but I'm here to help. Let me sleep here. Maybe a night, maybe two.
Then what?
Then we save your brother.
I let him in and directed him to my bedroom, where he quickly collapsed. He hasn't moved since. I'm terrified. Richard can come at any moment. He does that, pops in randomly with no advance warning. I hope he stays away, and I hope Thomas wakes up soon. I'm ready. I really will do anything for my brother. Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed this story. I wanted to come and put a little aside in here to let everyone know that this is the last part of the series. The author didn't write anymore. This is supposed to be the end, and it kind of ends pretty abruptly, but it picks up a little bit in one of her other series. It's connected. I think just the lore and universe is connected, and the other series is called My Husband Killed My Stalker, and that is going to be the next story that I do. But I just wanted to let everyone know, because I know that with this ending, there's just going to be a lot of people asking, where's the next part? Why does it end like that? And that's why she decided to make it end really ambiguously like this. So I will do the next part. Hopefully we can get some answers, because a lot of stuff happened in this last part. That's kind of crazy. A lot of characters are introduced all of a sudden that we don't really know who they are. And I think that at least some of the characters will come back in that other series, so I'll do that as soon as I can. At the end of this series, I really started to connect with the main character. I hate that it ended so abruptly, because I finally started to feel bad for her, kind of at the very end here. She just became so broken after she saw her little brother in that nightmare. So I don't know. I really finally started to connect with her, and now the story's over. I don't know. Maybe we'll see a little more of what happens, but from what I've gathered, I don't think we specifically see what happens to her, but I guess we'll see. I just hope that you liked the story. I had a fantastic time making it. And I'll see you next time. Jesus Christ!
What's this?
I'm in the middle of recording. It's the Dark Somnium, everybody.
Not for long.
Oh God!